Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Doug. And it's really a deep honor to be here at the University of South Carolina to talk with you about the future of the U.S. economy. And I just want to say that they're still counting the votes, as far as I understand. So we'll see. But no, I did run because I thought that it was important for somebody to provide some content, some substance to this whole discussion about where the country is and where it's going to go, or where it should go, how to fix our problems. Somebody who is not partisan. I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I did work in the Reagan administration, but I didn't vote for President Reagan at the time. I just thought that the country needed some, well, I was at New Haven at the time, and I also wanted to get a date, and you can't do it in New Haven. So I had ulterior motives, but I also wanted to get the experience of working at the Council of Economic Advisors, and that was quite an experience, and so I'm glad I did that. But the country today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of where we are in terms of the economic realities, and then talk about the policies that President-elect Trump has in mind. Yeah, it's hard to wrap your brain around this a little bit. We're also geared towards having Clinton as the president. I think she would have been dangerous in a different way than Trump, but also dangerous. But I'm going to try and tell you what I think he has in mind doing from everything I can glean, and then contrast that with what needs to be done. I'm going to try and do all of this in about a half an hour or so that I can have some time, about 15 minutes for Q&A, and Doug's going to keep me to good behavior here. So what are the implications of President-elect Trump's for the U.S. economy? Well, let's look at the background. So what you see here is a picture of growth rates. You know, they were negative in the Great Depression and positive, and then, but they've been basically heading downhill. So our growth rates have been quite low for quite, it's really a downhill decline. Part of this is demographic, that our population growth rate has slowed up. Part of it is education. We're not educating our children as well as we used to. Part of this is competition from abroad with low-wage countries. Part of this is the automation of industry and other kinds of jobs. There's hardly any job you can think of, from bombing our enemies to rubbing our backs, that a machine can't do these days. So we have these huge factories being set up with very few people to work there. It's just robots. And part of this, of course, is immigration. We've had a lot of discussion of illegal immigration, but over the last decade, about 100,000 illegal immigrants more have left the country than have come. So our net flow of illegal immigrants is actually negative. So if you put a wall up, you're going to keep the illegal immigrants from leaving. So I hope that when we put the wall up, we'll have a door and a red carpet so that the ones who want to leave can leave. But the real issue is legal immigration. We've been bringing in over 1 million people a year. If we continue doing this for the next 45 years, we will increase the population by 100 million people. That's the population of the Philippines. Imagine bringing the entire Filipino population to the United States today and planting them in the U.S. in proportion where they are now. But of course, they would tend to migrate to the cities. So in Boston, you can hardly drive in many parts of the day. And at some point, the traffic would become very similar to what it is in Manila, where it takes about 2 hours to go 1 mile, because I've actually experienced that. So we're making no preparations. We're putting a lot of downward pressure on the wages of low and medium-skilled people with all the immigration. We're not really thinking about how many immigrants we want to have in the country and what their skill composition should be. That should have been discussed by somebody in the debate. Not the illegal immigrants, but the legal immigrants. And now maybe I missed it, but anyway, low growth, slow job recovery. We're still about 1.7% lower employment to population ratio than we should have based on just the demographics and the trends, which would be the blue line. So we have some underutilization of the workforce. A lot of people are disgruntled. They can't find jobs. They've dropped out of the workforce. They're not being counted among the unemployed when you look at the standard statistics. You have median household income has been declining despite overall labor productivity growth. This is reflecting to some degree the increase in inequality, that people at the top are making a whole lot more and people at the bottom are not. But in addition, some of the productivity is really reflective of the extra automation that's going on, the fact that robots are counted as capital, but they're getting a bigger share of the pie, capital in general, compared to labor. So the labor share has in recent years been declining. So that's a concern, and where will that go? You know, when we get to the point where everybody's laid off by the robots and put out of jobs, who's going to be around to buy the products that the robots are making? So I did a paper with Jeffrey Sachs and a couple of grad students. It's at my website, kotlikoff.net. If you look under articles at kotlikoff.net, you can see a paper called Robots Are Us. It's a little model. It's got a little bit of mathematics, not too complicated for economists, but maybe for laymen. But you can just read the words and see that this is a very simple bread and butter model that shows that in the long run, the robots can make everybody worse off. We can end up with better technology, but because nobody's had enough wages to save out of, they don't accumulate enough physical capital. We end up in the long run with better technology but less physical capital, and everybody actually is worse off. That could happen. So we have to be talking and discussing and thinking about how do we respond to this new situation where robots can drive our cars and our trucks, and just there they can put 7% of the workforce out of business because 7% of our workforce is involved in transportation. They can also drive our airplanes at this point, fly our airplanes. So I'm going to bum you out. This is what economists do, you know. We're dismal people, we're dismal scientists, and that seems to be what we get paid to do, to get people depressed. But we have a lot of ammunition. Here's real wages, and they've been stagnating since about 1965. They're not a whole lot higher. Average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory employees, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in real dollars, inflation adjusted, have not risen for decades. This is really a picture of the end of the American dream right there. If you want to ask where's the American dream, it's dead, and it's right there in that picture. The real wages haven't gone up for many different reasons. I already named some of them. But this is take-home pay. If you include fringe benefits, there has been growth in real compensation, but most of this fringe benefit is really an employer paying a whole lot more for the same health care that you were otherwise going to get, and our health care outcomes are rather dismal relative to those of countries that are spending a whole lot less. So I wish I could say the fringe benefits were actually delivering something besides higher pay to hospital or hospital network CEOs, which seems to be, well, wait a second, Blue Cross. Everybody but Blue Cross. Sorry. I take it back. Sorry, Blue Cross. I'm in Blue Cross. I love Blue Cross. Okay. Saving and investment. Peter was just referencing saving and investment. This is a picture of net national saving, net domestic investment. I wish Hillary had presented this picture and had talked about it in the campaign. I wish Donald had done that. I wish anybody, Ted, any of these guys had actually talked once about substance, about anything. And here's our national saving rate, which was 15% or so, 16% in 1950. It's now down to 4%. That's the blue curve. Our domestic investment rate has come right down with it. The gap between the two curves is our current account deficit, how much investment we're getting from abroad coming into the U.S., and that's been reduced of late. So we were depending a lot on foreigners investing in the U.S. They've decided to invest other places. And so our domestic investment rate is also down to around 4%. So that's a picture right there of failure. Now, when you save less, you invest less. So if you're investing less, you have to be saving less. So if you're saving less, you have to be spending less. So then the question is, who's spending so much more? Maybe the government is spending a whole lot more on the military, on salaries for the president, for members of Congress. Maybe it's engaged in a lot more infrastructure spending. I don't know. It's not the case. What's happened is that government spending accounts for about 1 percentage point of the about 11 percentage point decline in national saving from 15% down to 4%. The other 10 percentage points is due to higher household consumption. And then we have to ask, who is it within the household sector who's been consuming so much more? Well, I'm going to show you the answer right now. This is a study done by Ronald Lee, who's a demographer and an economist at Berkeley. I've made similar pictures, but his go out a little bit more recently. And it shows you the age consumption profile, relative consumption by age. So you see in the first picture here, 1960, that a 40-year-old was consuming a whole lot more than a 75-year-old, right? And so just look at the height of that curve and compare where a 40 or 45-year-old is relative to a 70-year-old, or a 50-year-old compared to a 70-year-old. Today, in 2007, we don't have more recent numbers, you can see that the 70-year-old or 75-year-old is consuming a whole lot more than the 40-year-old. So there's been this massive redistribution from the young to the old in the form of social insurance programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I don't want to be bashing these programs. That's not my goal here. I think we need to have a system where we force people to save for their old age, because people will not do it on their own. We need to force people to have disability insurance, which Social Security provides. We need to force people to have life insurance, which people are not buying on their own. We need all these things, but we don't need to make young people pay for old people's stuff at a ever higher level. For example, President Bush, he passed Medicare Part D, which is drug insurance, prescription drug insurance for the elderly. Well, that's very important. The elderly need prescription drug insurance. Some of these drug medications, the infusion products, cost $200,000 a year or $20,000 a year. Nobody can afford it. We need insurance. But the way it was passed was without a single dollar increase in the taxation of any older person. Whether they're healthy or sick or rich or poor, they weren't asked to pay an extra penny. There was a $15 trillion unfunded liability created that day that they passed this bill. It was all left for younger people. Most of this room is filled with people who are going to have to pick up that extra $15,000 tab. The head of the Medicare, the chief actuary for Medicare, Rick Foster, was threatened that he would lose his job if he went public and described the fact that this was a huge expense and that was being left to the next generation. He subsequently was brought before Congress and testified publicly that he would have been silenced. Paul O'Neill, the former Secretary of Treasury, was going to put out a report about the country's overall fiscal long-term situation and the implications for our kids on December 7th, 2002. Yesterday was December 7th, right? Well, there was another Pearl Harbor Day that happened in 2002. Paul O'Neill was unceremoniously fired by Dick Cheney, whose view about debts and deficits and so forth and fiscal issues was, let the next administration worry about it. We're here to get reelected. So they fired him because they knew that O'Neill was going to put out this report in the president's budget about our long-term fiscal gap, and that it was going to be very bad news and was going to stop the passage of the Medicare Part D bill that President Bush, as designed, that President Bush wanted to pass in order to win the state of Florida. Remember, he had a tough time in the first go-around getting elected, and he had to we had to have all his counting chads or whatever. So he made sure that he secured the votes of the older people in Florida by passing Medicare Part D. Well, O'Neill was fired. The study that he had commissioned and was worked on for a year by a whole group within the Treasury, and these were students of mine and former co-authors. It was censored 2 days after O'Neill was fired. This stuff is not accidental. There's a conspiracy. It's not an explicit organized conspiracy, but there's a political conspiracy to rip off younger people at the benefit of older people who vote. Younger people on election day have jobs to go to. Older people are retired. They have nothing better to do than to vote. And they vote to a great degree. And in certain states, they are the voters, like in Florida. So, okay, here's what's happened to the ratio of average Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits per old person to per capita GDP. You can see it's gone up dramatically since 1975. It's more than doubled the relative payments. And that's not the only way in which we've been taking from the young and giving to the old. If we change the tax structure, we lower taxes on asset income, we lower capital gains taxes and dividends taxes, and we raise the taxes on workers' wage taxes. That's a shift from the old to the young. That's, again, a form of intergenerational redistribution. So that's one example. If we cut taxes for quite a while, like we did under Bush II, I think he presided over 4 different tax cuts. Well, and now President-elect Trump wants to cut taxes yet again. If my taxes go down for the next 10 years, well, I'm 65 now, I'll be 75. I will have escaped most of my years of, all those years of high taxes, I will have escaped. And then by the time they raise the taxes again, I'll be retired. You get the point, right? Somebody else is going to have to pick up the bill. This is the hospital pass that Peter was telling us about. So here's the fiscal gap. Here's the bottom line. Here's what happens when you put everything on the books. What the fiscal gap is, you take all the expenditures for Medicare, Medicaid, all those obligations to pay me my benefits are not on the books. They're not part of official debt. They're not part of the $20 trillion that Trump was referring to, and we heard about in the debates a little bit for a minute or two. Not part of it, not recorded. Enron would be blushing. The guys who ran the Enron scandal would be blushing at what Uncle Sam has been doing for 6 decades. Under every president from Eisenhower on, we've been running a Ponzi scheme, taking from the young, calling it taxation, giving to the old, but then telling the young, don't worry, you're going to get yours when you're older. And those obligations to the young when they're older are not put on the books because we use the word taxation and subsequent future transfer payments rather than borrowing and future repayment of principal and interest. It's that simple. You just use the right words, you don't get it on the books. You put everything on the books, you get to the fiscal gap. You take all the spending, no matter what it's called, including servicing the official debt, and you project it out, and you present value it, figure out the value in the present. What is a real dollar 50 years from now worth in today's terms? And then you do the same thing with taxes, and you compare the two, and you ask, what's the difference? That's the fiscal gap, and the difference is $206 trillion. So we're not $20 trillion in debt, we're $206 trillion in debt. It's 10 times bigger than the number Trump was using. It's 10 times bigger than our national average annual GDP. We could work for 10 years and do nothing but save up the money and consume not a single penny and not invest a penny and just save up all the output. And that's what it would take to cover, in roughly speaking, the spending that we cannot pay for given our tax system. So we have an option here. We're about 53% under finance, meaning that we need to have, if we want to do all this spending into the future that we have projected by the Congressional Budget Office. These are not my projections. They're based on the Congressional Budget Office's what's called alternative fiscal scenario. They're realistic projection of the future spending under current policy. So this is what current policy says. If you want to spend, as we're suggesting we're going to do under current policy, you have to raise every single federal tax rate. So I'm talking about corporate income tax rates. Trump wants to cut them. The personal income tax rates, they all have to go up 53%. Trump wants to cut them. Excise taxes have to go up by 53%. Payroll taxes, the FICA tax has to go up by 53%. The estate and gift tax rates have to go up by 53%, starting today. If we don't do this, if we wait, for example, for about 20 years till 2045, who's going to get off the hook? Doug and I are going to get off the hook. We're the guys with the gray hair, right? But younger people, anybody who doesn't have gray hair in this audience, you're all going to be left on the hook because you're going to have to pay not a 53% higher tax on everything, but a 69% higher tax. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about your kids paying that higher tax, about the kids you haven't had yet? How are they represented in all this discussion? Where are their votes? What about the teenagers? They're not getting any representation. This is not exactly what you call a democracy, when you don't have any voice for the next generation, when you don't have adults running the country. The first obligation of an adult is taking care of their children. And when you're not thinking about these numbers and you're hiding these numbers, the CBO refused to publish these numbers. There's a website called the informact.org, the THEINFORMACT, theinformact.org. The idea is to inform people. It's a bill that I drafted for members of Congress. Tim Kaine, who was the VP choice of Hillary Clinton, is one of the co-sponsors of this bill, along with Senator Thune, who's the Republican senator from South Dakota, one of the two Republican senators. So they co-sponsored this bill, and we got basically a who's who of economists, including 17 Nobel laureates, to endorse the bill that would require the CBO just to put out these numbers on their front page of their website. And the CBO director is refusing to do it. He's a Republican. The prior one, who was a Democrat, refused to do it. The prior one before that, June O'Neill, was a Republican. She refused to do it. The one before that was a Democrat. So they're all conspiring to keep this information from the public. When it starts to become public, when somebody in the government tries to make it public, they fire Rick Foster, or they threaten his job, or they fire Paul O'Neill. And this is just ongoing. This is where we are. So this is a reality that we're facing. The country's broke. It's not broke in 30 years or 50 years. It's broke today. This is our credit card bill, $206 trillion. We owe it today. It's growing at interest. It'll be $6 trillion higher a year from now if we do. It will actually be bigger because of what Trump has in mind doing. So we've also, when you see countries that are broke, I don't know if you can see this a little bit faded light, but you see the increase in the money supply that the Fed has printed since 2007. It was about $800 billion then. We're now up to about $4 trillion. So we've increased the printing of money by about $3.2 trillion in the last 9 years. Janet Yellen has stopped that. She was a professor of mine. She knows that it's not the right thing to do have the Federal Reserve print money so Congress doesn't have to raise taxes or cut spending. But that's what they've done. Quantitative easing has been easing the burden on the Congress to pay its bills. And this is what you see in a developing country that's broke. You see the central bank printing money to pay the bills of the country, and you see this in Argentina in the past, in Zimbabwe. There were 20 countries that ran hyperinflations in the last century. They were all connected to fiscal policy. Not one of them had their fiscal act in order. They all started printing money to pay their bills. If we, I'm not going to go through the little math here, but if we had the same conditions in our money market, the rate at which money moves around and circulates, called the velocity of money in the economy, and the rate at which banks lend out money, the money multiplier, if we had those two rates equaling today what they did back in 2007, our price level would be 3 times higher. We'd have a 300%. So we're set up to have a 300% inflation between now and whenever, very soon. because we've printed so much money and the banks are sitting on so much excess reserves and money is circulating at such a slow pace that overnight we could have a 300% increase in prices, and that would produce what's called a hyperinflation. And then you'd see interest rates go sky high, and you'd have banks who are holding long-term bonds suffer major losses in their assets. Just like Italy today is facing a banking run, we've not fixed the banking system, so we could have yet another financial crisis. So am I making you happy or really sad? I mean, how many people need a antidepressant break? Okay. So feel free, there's some water somewhere to, some back here if you need to go run to get some pills. The global financial system is extremely fragile. It was built to fail. It was rebuilt to fail by Dodd-Frank, arguably faster, because Dodd-Frank says that it's harder to bail out these big banks and the small banks. So if you understand that you hear some rumor that there's some bad assets, you start running that much more quickly to get your money out, and nobody can calm you down or it's harder to calm people down who are running because the Federal Reserve and the Treasury have their hands much more tied because of Dodd-Frank. The core problems with banking remain opacity and leverage. Dodd-Frank hardly mentions opacity at all, doesn't do anything fundamental with respect to leverage. So the banking system, which is a faith-based or trust me banking system, has been rebuilt to the same way that it was, basically with a lot more bureaucrats running around saying they're fixing things. But let's talk about the specifics. I've got 15 more minutes, right? 15 minutes. I'm going to take you through President Trump's 4 big policies that President-elect Trump is going to, I think, run if we look at what he has said publicly or what his advisors have said publicly or what Paul Ryan and others in Congress have said publicly. And I'm going to talk about why these policies are so problematic and what we should actually do to get it right, to fix things. The tax reform. The president-elect wants to cut the taxes of all businesses, including proprietorships and corporations, down to 15%. This is why the stock market's booming. Now, think about it. Every single professor in this university could resign from the university tomorrow and reestablish themselves as a consultant and sell their services back to the university as private businesses and then be taxed at a 15% rate. So anybody above a 15% marginal tax rate in a bracket that's above 15% can lower their taxes dramatically from, in my case, I'm in the 39% tax bracket. The effective bracket's actually around 43%. I can go down to 15% almost overnight just by that little gimmick. That's, that somebody would design a tax proposal with this glaring problem just suggests the quality of the people that they have to help the president-elect to think about how to fix the tax system. It's obvious to every public finance economist in the country takes a look at this for 2 seconds and says, big problem. It's like designing a bridge over the Hudson River, and you have engineers, and every engineer sees that there's not enough support and the bridge is going to collapse within a year. Well, this is going to blow a big hole in the deficit. The country's already broke. We're going to be even broker very soon. The bill is also highly regressive. If somebody who's relatively high income person like myself can get off paying 15%, then that's not fair. There's nothing in his bill that's going to get the super rich to pay anything more, including himself. And there was nothing actually in Hillary Clinton's bill that would have gotten the super rich to pay a penny more, because here's what the super rich do. Let's suppose that Doug had $1 billion. What would he do? And this is what the super rich do, because I've talked to the super rich. I've talked to billionaires. This is exactly what they do. They're not necessarily in real estate. What they do is they just borrow against their wealth. They take all their wealth, they put it in diversified investments that don't pay off any dividends or capital gains. They don't realize any taxable income. They borrow money. They pledge their wealth as collateral against their borrowing. They borrow as much as they need to consume, so they have a great lifestyle. They report no taxable income, and then when they pass away, they hand their appreciated wealth to their children via what's called a step-up in basis, so their kids don't have to pay any capital gains, any of the accrued capital gains on that wealth, and so they never pay any income taxes on that accrual of capital gain of asset income, and then they hand the money to the kids in excludable trusts, which then mean that there's very little estate and gift taxation that has to that arises. So as a result, the rich fully escape taxation. They wouldn't pay any more taxes were Hillary Clinton president with her tax reform. Nobody discussed this openly because we had nobody who really understood, I think, the fiscal realities of how things work. Maybe Trump understands this. He kept saying he knows more about avoiding taxes than Hillary, and he certainly has paid no taxes from what it sounds like. So, but he's not doing anything to fix things. So what I would do, what I would do is I'd eliminate, I do things that sound really ultra-right. I'd eliminate the corporate and personal income taxes day one. I'd eliminate the estate and gift taxes. All three of these taxes are highly dysfunctional. They're not generating much in the way of revenue, and they are basically employing an army of lawyers and accountants to avoid taxation. So let's get rid of them. Let's eliminate the ceiling on the FICA tax to make the FICA tax not regressive but proportional, so that everybody pays the FICA tax, which is the Social Security and Medicare tax. We adopt a 20% value-added tax. This is what Ted Cruz was recommending, and every other developed country has a value-added tax. We'd adopt a 20% tax on inheritances above $5 million. So if Warren Buffett, I know he's leaving all his money to the Gates Foundation, but if instead he just left it to everybody in the country, the same fixed amount, it would not come to $5 million per person. It would be much less. There would be no inheritance tax being paid because he would be doing something to equalize the wealth distribution. If he left it just to his child, his son, then the son would have to pay inheritance taxes. And this is a high enough threshold such that small farms would not have to break up to meet that inheritance tax. I'd also have a progressive personal consumption tax on those consuming more than $100,000. This would be a cash flow tax. The cash in minus the cash out, your deductions for money you spend on investments and charitable contributions. What the difference would be measured as consumption. You'd have to pay taxes on that. You'd also have to pay taxes on your consumption services from your yachts and your homes and your mansions and your airplanes. All that is a form of consumption. It would all be included. So this is how you get the super rich to actually pay something, they pay their fair share, and how you make it progressive. I'd also have a CO2 emissions carbon tax of $80 per cubic ton. We could get rid of the EPA and maybe not get rid of the EPA, but much of the work of the EPA and other government regulations is not necessary if you just have a carbon tax, and the Koch brothers can deal with that. Look, here's your carbon tax. That's correctly pricing the damage to the future generations from what you're doing. Now go and try and make as much money as you can. We'll open up the Keystone Pipeline, but the shale oil that comes in, which is extra special dirty, is going to face an extra special tax. Well, it's going to be based on their CO2 emission, and it's going to be properly priced. And then it's your game to make as much money as possible. Exxon, whatever, knock yourself out, but pay the price of what you're doing to the country and to the world. That's what an economist says to do. That's what every economist says to do if they know economics. So we should do that. We should have a $2,000 payment per person independent of income because we're getting rid of the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. So we need to have a welfare system, and this would provide essentially the equivalent for a family of four. That's $8,000. I'd also change the food stamp program so that it's direct distribution of food. So here's what I'm trying to do here is make sure that everybody ends up in a 30% tax bracket when it comes to working. If you're very poor, if I see it's Joanne here? What? Juanita. I'm sorry, I can't read that. Juanita, suppose Juanita was a minimum wage worker, and she's got a family of 4, and you're maybe a family of 3, you're the primary earner, and you're working at McDonald's. If you earn more money, you're going to lose 23 cents in food stamps. Another $1, you lose 23 cents in food stamps. You lose 22 cents in the earning of tax credit. You lose 7 cents in the South Carolina income tax, right? You lose 5, maybe, what do you have, a 5-cent sales tax? 6 cents sales tax. Okay, so now we're up to a lot of taxes. Now you also lose any welfare benefits and maybe housing support. You could also lose your Medicaid benefits, which could be, $10,000 if you think about the family of 4. So when you start adding up all these taxes, you see that the poor, to a large extent, are being locked into poverty. This is why we have endemic poverty here. We have a poverty trap. I want to make sure we get rid of that poverty trap as part of the reform. That's how you fix taxes. Social Security. Social Security is 32% underfinanced. The Detroit pensions were 20% underfinanced when they drove Detroit bankrupt. So the rest of the fiscal system is 53% underfinanced. It cannot bail out Social Security. That's the bill, the credit card bill for Social Security right now. So when Bernie Sanders says, don't worry about Social Security, it'll take care of itself, it won't take care of itself. That was a charade. That was a farcical statement that he made. It indicated that he doesn't either understand our fiscal situation or he's lying about it. So the way we need to fix Social Security is, and here's what our president-elect wants to do, nothing. He wants to leave Social Security the way it is and not even increase the retirement age. So it will end up in worse fiscal shape at the end of his next 4 years, and that burden will fall on our kids. So my policy would be we freeze the existing system in place, we phase in a new Social Security system, and that's fully funded, that people contribute to, the government makes a matching contribution, the contributions are split 50-50 between spouses, the entire account balance that you have, each person has a personal security account, it's invested not by Wall Street but by a computer so that everybody gets exactly the same return. It's invested in a global market-weighted index of stocks and bonds and real estate, all by a computer. I have a little Air laptop that could do the entire job. It would also take the assets at retirement age of a cohort and gradually transform them, sell them off at the market price, put them into inflation index bonds, and use that inflation index bond income and principal return to pay inflation index annuities to the personal security account holders in proportion to their balances. So this is a very simple, clean fix that has been endorsed by top economists. I developed this with Jeff Sachs. The healthcare, the banking policy that they're going to likely enact is the Financial Choice Act, which is coming out of the House Financial Services Committee. And it's eliminating a good chunk of Dodd-Frank. And it says to banks, look, you can get out from under all of Dodd-Frank's regulations. All you have to do is show us that you have a capital requirement of 10%, that your capital is equal to 10% of your assets. And, well, that sounds like a reasonable thing. You have if you make the banks secure, then they shouldn't have to be regulated. Well, 3 days before Lehman Brothers went under, their capital ratio was not 10%, but 11%. It was actually higher than this number, and they went under 3 days later. So the fact that assets have a certain value today, if I have a lot of assets today and I've got these liabilities, then the difference is my capital. And so the assets are high, my liabilities are here, I got a lot of capital. I've met the capital ratio. But the next day there's a rumor about my assets being no good. The assets go down to here, my capital goes down to nothing. And so you cannot predict today what the capital ratio will be tomorrow. We saw this with Bear Stearns. Their stock was at $75 a share. A week before it was at $2 a share. So this whole idea that the government can foresee via stress test what what's going to happen was just negated in the last episode. It was like we had this big financial crisis, and the people trying to fix things for the future were not around, because everything they're doing to quote fix it, has nothing to do with the reality of what happened. So this is not something that's actually going to keep the country safe. It's just going to, I think, make it less safe, because they're also going even beyond Dodd-Frank and limiting the ability of the government to provide bailouts. And so you've made the system in many ways more risky, and having less stopgap measures or facilities. I've got one more minute or minute and a half here. Let me see. So my banking policy, it's called limited purpose banking. I'm not going to have time to get through it, but everything becomes a 100% equity financed mutual fund. We run the entire banking system that way. There's a book called Jimmy Stewart is Dead that I wrote, which you can read. And it's a Wonderful Life, the movie where Jimmy Stewart was the hero. We don't have any Jimmy Stewarts around anymore. Jamie Dimon is the head of Morgan Stanley. He's not J.P. Morgan. He's not an upright guy, I don't think. He's presided over all kinds of corruption and graft in his time running J.P. Morgan. So we can fix banking, but we have to do it the right way. I hope J.P. Morgan is not another sponsor. Not now. I may not be back for a while. But healthcare reform. The president is going to do just enough to kill off Obamacare, put 20 million people who are now insured out, leave them with no insurance. I don't like Obamacare. I think it was a terrible way to fix the healthcare system, but it's better than nothing. He's going to go back to nothing. My healthcare reform, which is called the Purple Health Plan, gives everybody an identical basic plan and you get a voucher and you get this voucher for free. The government pays for it, so we have a single payer, but we have multiple providers. So the insurance companies, including Blue Cross, compete with each other to provide this basic plan. It's paid for by Uncle Sam. The tax system that I'm designing would pay for all the vouchers. The vouchers sum up to a fixed amount of GDP, 7%. It doesn't go up to 20% of GDP. We don't drive our kids broke. Everybody has the same basic plan. Everybody's liver is exactly identically covered. If you can afford to have angioplasty at 90, if you can buy a supplemental policy, you can do that. But otherwise, we have a highly competitive system around the basic plan. It becomes a commodity just like wheat or cotton, where everybody's competing to provide the basic plan. And people with pre-existing conditions like diabetes get a much bigger voucher so that the insurance companies have no incentive to cherry pick. The voucher you get is individually experience rated. So that's a way to fix health care, and 5 Nobel laureates have endorsed this plan. So the bottom line on Trump's economics, we're going to have massive deficits, high inflation, high interest rates. The fiscal gap will dramatically worsen. No Social Security reform. Healthcare reform dramatically increases the number of uninsured. Banking reform leaves the U.S. at worse risk of another financial meltdown. Tax reform is fiscally irresponsible and highly regressive. Now I don't have any good news to say about, I wish I had some good news. I'm going to just take some questions at this point. But, I'm hoping that everything I said is wrong. I'm hoping that the president's going to keep surprising us and actually do something reasonable, that he'll bring somebody in as economic advisor who will actually kind of has some grasp on what needs to be done, because these ideas coming out of Congress and out of the people that he's selected for his cabinet and the House Financial Service Committee, they're just not the answers. Believe me, they're part of the problem. So, but we voted for him collectively, and we're stuck with him, so we have to help him. There is an answer here, a book. If you go to Kotlikoff.net, you can click on a book called You're Hired, a Trump Playbook for Fixing America's Economy. It's what I think is wrong with the country and how to fix it. If you could just pull up that book and forward it to your members of Congress and their chiefs of staff and everybody else in the country and ask everybody else to do it, we might get word to the country about what economists think needs to be done, because this playbook is really what economists collectively think should be done to fix the country. It's not just my views. I talked to a lot of economists in developing this playbook, but it is a comprehensive solution. So please take a look at that and send it along. You can do something to turn things around just by your little old self, because we're each megaphones thanks to the internet. Question right here.
I talked about inflation going up 300%. Does that mean if current inflation is 1.5, we would see inflation going to 4.5?
No, it would go up to 3. You know, if it went up in 1 year, it would go up to 301%. Yeah, that's when you print. You increase the money supply by a factor of 4 in 9 years compared to the prior, whatever, like 90-year history, almost 95-year history. You've done some big things, and so we could have hyperinflation, thanks to Bernanke, and he's got this book out called The Courage to Act. I would say it should be called The Courage to Screw Up. Yes.
Some authors have found recently published that they think finance takes up too much of the economy, and that's part of the problem we have with growth, productivity, stability, and so forth. Right. Do you agree?
I think it does, and I think what we need is a very simple financial system with real-time disclosure by a single government agency, not 150 government agencies regulating, and they're all equity financed. And if you look at the equity financed mutual funds, where there are about 7,000 of them, where you have your retirement money, for example, in a Fidelity or T. Rowe Price or whatever, Vanguard, not a single one of them got into any trouble during the financial crisis. So if we just build our houses out of brick, not out of straw, we will get everything right, and we will have very simple, if you're trying to disclose something and that's a requirement, it has to be simple. So that's how we can get to a very simple financial system. So I'm with you on that, yeah. Right here.
Okay, when everybody gets nervous around the world, they come to us. Where would you suggest that I liquidate my assets and immigrate to? I'm hoping that you're going to say Canada, but I really would like someplace warmer.
Well, if you look at countries that have good fiscal policies, there's Australia and New Zealand. Of course, the demand for their products is very much a function of the world economy. Chile has got at least in the prior administration, had a pretty responsible fiscal policy. There's not a lot of country. Norway. Norway's a country that if you bought long-term Norwegian bonds, for example, that would probably be a good bet, or Danish bonds. Well, you don't have to go with your money. Just send your money. Mail your money. Yes, back there.
I just wondered when you saw the tipping point for this coming and what some of the warning signs might be of when we hit tipping point, and sort of an outlook for the next 12 months, too.
Tipping points are very hard to, the economy is very psychological. I think what happened with Lehman Brothers is that we tipped psychologically. It wasn't that the building just fell apart or that the people in the building who got fired died. The physical condition of the country didn't change. Everybody just got panicked, including the Wall Street banks. They stopped lending to each other. The financial system froze up. That was the last straw. And I think every action the government took was something that actually enhanced the panic to a large extent. And maybe it was necessary, but if we didn't have this kind of a system to begin with, we wouldn't have had the collapse. So exactly when the tipping point occurs, if everybody knew that, we would never see these big gyrations in the stock market from one day to the next. So nobody can actually know, because a lot of this is psychological. A lot of this is what we call multiple equilibria, where it's unpredictable exactly what that extra piece of news will be that will flip the entire economy. How many times can Trump tweet that he's going to raise tariffs on China and this country and that country until people will get sufficiently nervous to sell their stocks the next morning? I don't know what the last tweet will be. All I do know is that we have, underneath everything, apart from his tweets, we have this growing cancer in our country that's been going for 6 decades. And when that cancer is going to hit an organ, I can't say. How's that for fun? Yes, sir.
Washington got enough sense to cut costs or get rid of fraud, waste, and abuse?
Not if they don't understand how broke we are, not if they think they can cut taxes and get more revenue. I don't know any real economist who thinks, apart from partisan people on the right, who think that you can cut taxes and get more revenue. If that was a great idea, we should cut taxes to zero, right? And then we got the people on the left, like Krugman, who think you can just spend your way to prosperity. Well, if that's true, we should just increase spending by a factor of 20, not raise taxes, and watch the economy boom and get a whole lot more taxes to not only, to pay for all the extra spending and more. But nobody really believes that. So I think crazy, stupid voodoo ideas should be pushed to the limit, and these are such ideas. So, I don't see the president cutting spending by more than he's cutting taxes. He hasn't talked about cutting spending, right? He hasn't talked about fixing Social Security or fixing Medicare or fixing, Medicaid might be turned over to the states, but there's no understanding of why is it that the healthcare system doesn't work? Why do we have the government involved here? And it has to do with the cherry picking of the insurance companies, the fact that they don't know, and they do this defensively. They don't know who's coming to them. They don't know if somebody's got cancer or not, or diabetes or not, and the person's not necessarily revealing that, so they have to charge a high premium to defend themselves. And then that premium is very high, and the people that are healthy, that don't have cancer or diabetes, don't buy it, and then we have a pool of very sick people, and we have all these uninsured people. That's the basic adverse selection problem. The way around that is to have this person who's got diabetes and cancer to have his medical record sent down to Washington. He gets experience rated through a computer, and then he's given a voucher that reflects his expected costs under the basic plan. And then now you've got a huge voucher, and I, as the insurance company, realize that you're quite sick, but that you're also very profitable to me because you have a huge voucher. The typical voucher might be $5,000. You've got a $45,000 voucher. I'd love to have you. That's how you fix the problem. You go right to the core of the problem, which is adverse selection. You don't sit around and screw around for another 20 years with crappy healthcare systems because you haven't addressed the key problem. Had Hillary Clinton had one debate where she laid out the problem and explained it, she would have won the election. Had she said anything intelligent about any problem, she would have won the election. Because we know the other guy wasn't saying anything intelligent about anything. So, but she didn't, she was too arrogant. She knew she was going to win just because she was Hillary Clinton. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned anything about defense. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think Janet Yellen is nobody's lunch meat, and she's not going to be pushed around by Trump. I don't know if she'll be reappointed, but as long as she's in office, she's not going to do anything crazy, and she's not going to continue to accommodate an irresponsible fiscal policy. So if the country gets into trouble, it'll have to be on the backs of Congress and the president.
I think you asked about defense.
You said about defense spending?
Right.
What will happen with defense spending? I think
Comments on defense. That's a big part of the budget.
I think when you have generals in every cabinet position, you're going to have a lot of defense spending. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for
One more question back here?
Questions?
Yeah, with Trump's new economic policies, how do you think that that's going to affect the U.S. agricultural industry as far as imports, exports?
Well, we could have a meltdown in trade with Canada, over soft lumber that could explode. The reason having all these public discussions in a very open way is going to lead other people to publicly go after us, and then he's going to respond in the middle of the night. And so we could have a breakdown in trade throughout the world, and that's going to impact agriculture because we export a lot of agricultural products. So that's making me nervous. Now, I know that we'd like to say, everything's upbeat. It's all upbeat for South Carolina, but the rest of the country is in trouble.
That comes next. Okay. One more question? Okay.
Is the slide set available online?
Yes, it will be.
It will be, yeah. And this book is available just at Kotlikoff.net for free. Yeah.
Okay. I see somebody really wants to ask a question back.
I just want to know, was this the good news or the bad news?
This is the best of the bad news. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kotlikoff.